A record number of visitors were registered at the Last Rock Music Festival. The organizers report about 15,000 guests who came from all corners of our vast homeland. The TV on the fridge was broadcasting. Alex grinned, turned off the kettle, and looked out the window. From the height of the 9th floor, there was a perfect view of the consequences of the record number, in the form of tattered and abandoned tents, mountains of junk, and wandering hungover crowds who had not yet recovered from a week's break and had not gone back home. Police buses and utility vehicles were beginning to arrive at the festival site to clean up the debris. Alex pulled out his telescope and focused on the future scene. Having participated in such events more than once himself, he knew in advance how the authorities would turn out and anticipated a merry circus with police and clowns. The day was sunny. There were no clouds in the sky, except for 2 smoky chimneys of a chemical plant a few kilometers away from the festival. So the informals had no reason to leave the settled field. Alex estimated how long it would take both sides to warm up and started making sandwiches. Meanwhile, the faults at the substation are still unresolved. Emergency officials say the fire has been extinguished, but the power failure caused an emergency in one of the buildings at the Sound Resource Solutions chemical plant. Personnel are already being evacuated from there and cooling circuits are being stabilized as a matter of urgency. Guy snuggled into the telescope and turned the finder over to the chimney's smoky sky. Lower down, he could see the confusion and panic that had engulfed the high-fenced area. People in chemical protection were running among the buildings and cars. Hoses were blasting tight jets of red foam directly into the windows. Buses and vans packed with people were hurriedly pulling away from the gates. In some places, through cracks in the roofs, thin, oily strings of black smoke stretched. Shit, what a pity that all this happens on the same day. Fidgetily moving the telescope from the factory to the field and back again, Alex forgot about food, trying not to miss anything. The police were already lined up in a chain, surrounding the grouping informals, and in the factory, cracking and scattering debris. One of the buildings was collapsing, distant echoing commands from the loudspeaker, calling to calmly leave the site of the festival, mixed with the rumbling explosions of underground tanks. The guy literally stuck to the telescope, forgetting to breathe and trying not to miss anything. There was a growing rumble from above, and an emergency plane flew toward the plant, almost over the roofs of the houses, dropping a heavy red cloud of powder over the area, which slowly settled on the buildings covered with smoke and flames. People in chemical protection ran around the territory, looking for shelter, and Alex couldn't believe his eyes. Those of them who hadn't managed to hide from the powder fell to the ground in agony, while the red dust dissolved overalls, clothes, and got to the flesh. Meanwhile, on the field, the first clashes between the police and the crowd began, with sticks, bottles, and gas grenades flying over heads. The loudspeaker was blaring, begging them to get the hell out of here. Alex looked at his watch. Only 40 minutes had passed, and the events were developing as if in some blockbuster. Attention, listen to the emergency alert. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Due to the threat of dangerous poisonous emissions at the chemical plant, the entire population of the northern and Zavodsky districts is required to proceed immediately, taking only documents, to the station. The worried face of the news anchor disappeared for a moment in the interference, and immediately after that a deafening alarm siren wailed over the city. Alex pointed the telescope at the factory, and his legs became absorbent cotton. The buildings and individual structures were crumbling along the first floors, releasing a purple, pulsating mass. The survivors rushed with all their might to the fence and gates, but fell into this flowing stuff and were swallowed up by it. From behind the walls, the sounds of panic fuss of the neighbors reached the guy. Doors slammed. The rumble of 10 feet on the stairs. Gradually, this noise moved to the street, but fascinated by the observation, Alex kept postponing and postponing his own evacuation. In the meantime, the police began to crowd the informalists, taking them one by one out of the crowd and dragging them into the buses. They didn't bother to use force, as if they were in a hurry to get away from there, taking as many people as possible. A few black dots appeared on the horizon. Even before they enlarged, they were overtaken by the sound of propellers cutting the air. And then, Alex saw several thin black threads stretching towards the factory. Explosions and flames covered the area behind the fence. Debris soared into the air. Helicopters flew over the field and began circling the fire, raining machine guns and rocket launchers down on the ground. Purple debris flew upward through the smoke. In the field, the police stopped dispersing the crowd and began to retreat little by little, retreating to their cars. The informals, mistakenly thinking that they had won, saw off the class enemies with shouts and laughter. Some, the bravest, continued to throw garbage. Suddenly, a deafening explosion shook the house. A black cloud grew over the place where the factory used to be, and large stone debris and purple fragments flew up into the sky, then rained down on the ground. One of the pulsing pieces fell right into the crowd on the field, burying several dozen people. People scattered, and the vile mass swallowed up the unfortunates and began to increase in size, throwing out outgrowths. Those who got in their way immediately fell to the ground and were enveloped by the moving purple flesh. The cops, no longer keeping order, rushed toward the buses, leaving the crowd to its fate. One of the helicopters detached itself from the group and began shelling the field, only increasing the rain of purple clots falling on the heads of the new victims. Finally, a long tentacle shot into the sky and latched onto the helicopter, pulling her into the center of the mass. Out of breath, Alex rushed away from the window, throwing things into her backpack in a hurry. Where are those damn car keys? Finally, in the pocket of one of the jackets jingled, he pulled on his boots and returned to the telescope one last time. No one else ran across the field. The police buses were dodging more and more tentacles shooting out from the giant-sized, fleshy mass that occupied almost the entire field. One of them managed to break through a window, and in a second, the entire interior was covered with purple slime, causing the bus to flip over. But that wasn't the worst of it. Long, vein-like threads stretched through the forest toward the city, with pulsing skeletons on the end of them like a leash. They lunged at the few people who had not yet evacuated and threw them to the ground, piercing them with their hands and pouring purple slurry from their open jaws. Alex was sickened by what he saw, but it was even worse when his eyes caught on a purple thread stretching straight to his yard. From somewhere on the lower floors came the rumble of a broken door, and first an outraged and then a frightened scream. The boy rushed to the door and looked through the peephole. No one was in yet. Another crack of the door being broken down, already right under his feet, in the apartment of the downstairs neighbors. Alex tiptoed out of the hallway, praying that not a single floorboard creaked, listening carefully to the silence. It was broken by the menacing hissing of the neighbor's cat, which, unfortunately, had been left behind in the commotion. The sounds of a brief struggle, and all was quiet, whimpering with fear and cursing his curiosity. Alex opened the door to the balcony as silently as he could and crawled in on all fours. There was nowhere else to hide. The plastic door cut off the noise in the entryway, but here the guy could clearly hear the last groans of pain of the poor people caught on the street. Shuddering at the moans and other people's agony, he huddled in a far corner, praying those things hadn't realized they'd peeked over the balcony. The rumbling in the apartment almost cost him his gray hair. Pressed into the wall, Alex stared wide-eyed in horror at the balcony door. A second, 2, 3. It lasted indefinitely. Holding his breath in fear, he nearly choked and now tried to suck in air as silently as possible through dried lips. The pounding of his heart in his ears almost drowned out everything else, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't pick up a sound from the apartment. Meanwhile, outside, everything had quieted down. Alex risked to look through the gap between the slab and the balcony fence, but saw only dozens of pulsating threads wreaths spreading across the yard. Not daring to do anything but wait, Alex sat motionless until his ass got stiff, and only then, Overpowering his fear, he decided to look through the window into the apartment. To look into the empty eye sockets of the skull pressed against the glass pane, braided with streams of pulsating purple flesh, as if he had been waiting for this moment. And with a silent scream, he pressed on the glass. Cracks started to form.